introduce our next speaker. Professor Jeffrey Canton is a professor of children's studies in the Department of Humanities here at York University. I've heard him speak previously, and I am really fascinated at the way he has made a serious scholarly study of the literature for children about the experience of children in residential schools. And without any further ado, I'll turn things over to Jeffrey.
So one of the things that I am trying to do in the work that I do is to make connections between children's literary texts and the residential school experience. And much of what I think about is the way that literature as a whole acts as a conduit for those experiences and allows us to, through our empathy, develop a relationship with the literary text. I truly believe, like Thomas King says in his Massey lectures, that the truth about stories is all there is. And so in some ways, I'm kind of a conduit, as it were, between John Malloy's talk on the residential schools, which is based on fact and on the documentation of those long histories, and Basil Johnson's own personal experiences, and thinking about how we can use children's books in particular to think about those experiences. Because, like the philosopher Stephen Law, I believe that the most important thing we have to do is to provide children with the tools for critically thinking about the world that we're in. And one of the things we have to do is take ownership and responsibility for our history as a nation. We have to think about, we often think of ourselves as this great good place, but I've often thought about my own childhood and my own childhood experiences of different cultures, different perspectives, different peoples. Why is it that as a young person in school in the 1970s, I didn't know anything about First Nations people other than that historic past that Basil Johnston talked about? That idea of First Nations people in terms of their dwellings and their traditions, the way they dress, their food, preparations. But I didn't know anything about real people or the real experiences that they had. One of the most transformative moments for me in my own childhood is an image that I have of my mother reading a book that was called A Child in Prison Camp. It was a book published in the mid-70s by a Canadian children's publisher called Tundra Books. May Cutler, who owned Tundra, was trying to create a body of literature that exposed young people to real experiences and different experiences. So she was the first person to publish a children's book about the internment of the Japanese Canadians, which is what A Child in Prison Camp was about. She wrote about the racism experienced by Chinese Canadians in Vancouver in the 1920s. She created books about the experiences of the Ukrainian Canadians on the prairies through the books of William Karelek, who is a well-known writer and artist. And she published a book of her own experiences as a child and her first connection to First Nations peoples in a book called I Knew an Old Indian Woman. But in thinking about those children's books, there were no children's books about real First Nations peoples. Tundra Books, in fact, published a lot of books about First Nations people, myths and legends. Wonderful books by, C.J. Taylor herself, a First Nations writer and artist, but nothing about their real lives. Why not? Why didn't we talk about these things? In 1992, in part to celebrate the 500th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America, Canadian publisher Groundwood Books published 2 books that year. One was Thomas King's, a picture book version of Thomas King's wonderful Coyote Columbus story, which if you haven't read it, is one of our true literary gems. And the other was a book called My Name is the Pizza. It was by a residential school survivor named Shirley Sterling, who in fact hadn't even thought about writing her own story and fell into it because she was doing a degree in creative writing, and this was the work that she was doing for her master's thesis. As she peeled away the layers of her own history, she discovered that this was a story that needed to be told, a story that was about, as we know, separation. Separation from your family, separation from your culture, from your traditions, separation from your language. That was the first book. Now, at the time, there was certainly a beginning of what is now a rich legacy of writings about the residential school experience, but there was nothing until 1992 for children of any real substance. But since then, there has become quite an interesting rich and interesting legacy. The most recent of which I'm going to show you is a book called When I Was 8. It's a really fabulous book by Margaret Pokiak Fenton, herself an Inuit survivor of the residential school system. She's written 2 books with her daughter-in-law, Christy Jordan Fenton, the first of which is called Fatty Legs and the other which is A Stranger at Home. And they beautifully exemplify what it is that the residential school experience did. Because one of the things about the children's literary texts is that they very nicely position the before and after experiences of First Nations children. They give us a real sense of the richness of the worlds that they came from. And this happens in book after book. I'm going to show you several of them. Larry Loy's As Long as the River Flows, and also, of course, the 2 books by Margaret Pokiak, as well as Nicola Campbell's Shishietko and Shinchi's Canoe. They all start off by talking about the world that the young people came from, and then there is always this moment in which they are ripped from that world and pushed forward into that civilizing space that John Malloy talked about. A situation that starts with a type of induction. You had your hair cut off. You were given a bath because you were unclean. You had to be put into clothes that were unfamiliar. You know, the native filmmaker Jules Kostasian and I were having a conversation. She'd gone on an exchange with Holocaust survivors to Auschwitz. And she said to me when we were talking, you know, there was a lot of similarities between the way that you were inducted into the death camps and the way that you were inducted into the residential schools. Maybe you weren't you weren't numbered in ink, but you were numbered in different ways. Sometimes some of the schools gave you numbers, but they certainly took away your name. My Name is the Pizza is written by Shirley Sterling. Larry Loy writes As Long as the River Flows, because in that book he calls himself, all the way through he calls himself Lawrence. That was the name that was used at the residential school, and he said to me in an interview that I did with him earlier this year, Lawrence is dead. Lawrence doesn't exist anymore. Lawrence is the person I was when I was in that school. Olomon Pokiak Fenton is the name that Margaret Fenton was born with. Why did we take away these children's names? Why did we take away their language? And you know, the story that that Basil told at the end about his sister is mirrored in the book A Stranger at Home, in which Oleman comes back to her community. She's met after 2 years of being away at residential school, and her mother doesn't recognize her. Margaret no longer is able to eat the traditional foods that were a part of her culture and upbringing. She finds blubber disgusting, and her mother has brought her a package of treats, things that she loved, and now she can't even bear them. And of course, she can no longer communicate. She's virtually a stranger. She's alienated. She's other. Now, a picture book that does this beautifully is Larry Loy's wonderful As Long as the River Flows. And I want to show you, I'm going to show you a number of the picture books, but what I love about this one in particular is the way that this is a story about Larry Loy's last summer on the land with his family. It's a very rich text that talks about their traditions, the kind of family dynamics, the different things that happened to this family in this last almost idyllic summer. One of the things, though, that I find so fascinating about all these picture books is how they position First Nations cultures, because they tell us something very important about the relationships between First Nations children, their families, and their communities. Unlike in our more Western, Eurocentric world where there's a clear separation between children and adults, one of the things that comes up in picture book after picture book, story after story, is how children are an actual integral part of the community and are accepted in the community. Sure, of course, there are different times where you can do different things, but children aren't seen as other in the way that they are othered in our world, and separated and made powerless. And one of the things about this book in particular is it's about Larry Loy's becoming a man. It's happening very gradually, but the other thing is that it shows us this world as having real resonance and power and importance for what it is, not for what it is going to be, but for what it is right then and at this particular moment. Now, one of the things that I really love about this book is that this is a story that focuses on this particular moment. It has these wonderful, lush watercolors that give us a real sense of the world that Larry Loy is living in. We go through this summer and the various things that happen to him, and then something happens. The children are going to residential school. This is one of a number of images that we see in picture book after picture book about that moment when the children are taken away. You can see the truck here in this image. This is the only image, by the way, where there's white people in the book, which I think is a very interesting comment that Loy is making about how separate the communities were. But here's the truck. There are the children. They can't see out of the truck. They're trapped. They're boxed in. That's what's going to happen. That's what John Malloy was talking about, the box cars. Those are the same kind of box cars, of course, that the Nazis used to take away the Jews. Box cars that separate them from their families, from their communities. And what this picture book does at this moment that's so interesting is that we go from these illustrations that are very rich and warm and give us a real sense of the landscape that Larry Loy's childhood is taking place in, Great Slave Lake in Alberta. And then what happens is we move to these photographs. And it's almost chilling, because we're not actually we don't have the book here. One of the things is as you turn the page and you go from these illustrations to these photographs, it's chilling in seeing the black and white world that is now going to become the place where Larry Loy and his brothers and sisters are taken away to. Black and white illustrations that mirror the black and white world of civilization. That civilization that took away language and culture and tradition and separated parents from children. Now, in her two books, Shishietko and Shinchi's Canoe, Nicola Campbell, again, looks at the way that this experience impacted on the children. I'm going to just show you a couple of images that I think are, so here's the truck again. You know, again, another one of these images. Her book, Shishietko, ends with the image of the children being taken away. But interesting enough, in Shinchi's Canoe, we see these two images, this one and then the following one, the children herded almost like animals. The other way that often the children's picture books talk about the way that children are separated is through boats, because of course a lot of these communities are fairly isolated. So for example, in Dave Robertson's Sugar Falls, which is a graphic novel for teenagers, one of the things that happens is the priest comes and takes away the child in a boat, and that's certainly the case as well in Fatty Legs too, so that there are these different modes of transporting young people out of this world. But the other thing, of course, that this experience does is not only does it herd them into this world, these big buildings, dormitories, where, again, no sense of personal, you know, here we are, we're supposed to be in these places that are both home and schools, but they're dormitories. They're not homes at all. There's no sense of individuality. There's no sense of your own space. And then you're in these places where the children, as we're told, for breakfast the children ate porridge and burnt toast. Through the doors they could see their teachers carrying steaming plates of bacon, eggs, and potatoes from the farms. So on the one hand, children are being given, you know, Margaret Pockiak talks about eating porridge that's almost tasteless, and all the way through A National Crime, one of the things that John Malloy talks about is the very poor standard of nutrition that so many residential schools gave to these children. But the teachers ate well. In fact, in a lot of these schools, children had to work very hard. Margaret Pockiak talks about going to school in June, but there was no education in her school until November. So between June and November, the children basically worked, and then they got, as we know, a substandard education. In fact, in the afterword to his book, Larry Loy says that many children could not, after being at residential school, read or write. What was the point of these schools then? Well, yes, partly to civilize them, but to civilize them in specific ways, and to educate them so that they could be menial workers, they could be laborers, they could be house servants, but they weren't going to be civilized, not civilized the way that we were going to be civilized. So one of the things that I think is so interesting is this, I mean, the way that this rich literature is been developing. We've got, as I say, a number of very powerful picture books that are really very, very impressive in terms of what they do. And as you know, very often when we talk about introducing, quote, difficult topics to children, there's always a fear of, oh, well, you know, when's the right time for this? One of the interesting things is that Groundwood Books, who published both the Nicola Campbell books and My Name is Pizza, puts the Nicola Campbell books in their age range from about kindergarten through grade 3, and sees no reason why we shouldn't be able to start talking about these things at this point. Now, one of the interesting things is that obviously, and this is what these books do so well is they deal with the issue of the abuse, but they think about the ages of the readers, the intended readers. So that, for example, in books like Shishietko and Shinshi's Canoe, the abuse is mostly verbal. As the books progress, it becomes verbal and physical. But it's not until a graphic novel like Sugar Falls, which is intended for a teen audience, that we actually get discussions, real serious discussions about the sexual abuse that took place. But often one of the things that is interesting in these books is the way that they create a connection between the way people look and the abuse. So that, for example, in Margaret's picture book, When I Was 8, the nuns have a very forbidding look to them and frightening. That sense of creating a gap between people as opposed to creating connections between them. These are books about young people being alienated, people being othered. And one of the things that I want to do as I move towards wrapping this up is to get us to think about the power that these texts have. So I want to tell you about blogger Chelsea Vowell, and who has a marvelous blog. I'm not going to try and butcher her name because I'm not going to say it right, her Métis name. But one of the things about Chelsea Vowell is that she herself has talked about introducing the residential school experience to her own children and how difficult this is. One of the things, though, that she notes are these picture books, and these are really powerful picture books, partly because, unlike other stories, they're not told by people who are not First Nations. In the case of Larry Loy, in the case of Shirley Sterling, in the case of Margaret Pocket Fenton, they're survivors themselves. Nicola Campbell is herself the child of survivors. Dave Robertson works in giving us a story of a First Nations elder named Betsy Ross who lives and works in Winnipeg. These are stories from within the First Nations community, so that they're not from an outside perspective. And I think that's one of the things that makes them the most valuable to us, that in using them, we're using the voices and the tools that First Nations are providing for us as allies. But in talking about Ruby, so Ruby was a 7-year-old girl in grade 2 who was asked to do a presentation at school. And she could choose any subject she wanted, and so she was passionate about sharing her knowledge about the residential school experience with her classmates. The only proviso made by the teacher was that she had to approve the topic before the kids went ahead and did a poster and got ready for their presentation. And so each child and a parent went to meet with the teacher, and Ruby's teacher said yes. And Ruby was delighted because this was something that was very important to her. It was important to her because she wanted to know why she herself did not speak her own language. And her father had explained to her that he had gone to residential school and no longer had a connection to it. And so as a whole, the family was taking language lessons, and we're trying to rebuild that connection. But the day after this meeting with her dad, Ruby's teacher said that she thought about it and that she didn't actually think it was a good idea. And one of the reasons why she didn't, some of the reasons why she said it wasn't a good idea were, and there's that wonderful picture of Thomas More here, but, it was an inappropriate topic, and the parents were putting their daughter up to it. She was too young or immature to tell her family stories. The other children were too immature to hear the story. They might get bored, and the teacher herself wasn't familiar with the topic. So these were good reasons not to do it. But, Ruby felt very passionate about this, and so her mother went to see the principal. And she did do the presentation eventually, although the teacher, of course, in terms of her reaction to it, certainly didn't give her the space she needed. But what I love about this story is that when Chelsea Vowell decided to write about it, she didn't go to the adults, she went to Ruby. And in her own words, Ruby said, "When I was in grade 1, my teacher said I was only to speak English at school. I didn't know why people didn't want us to speak our First Nation language. I talked to my mom and dad about it, and then my dad told me about residential schools." When she's asked about why she wanted other students in the class to learn, what she wanted them to learn, she said, "I chose the topic of residential schools because people need to know about the past. I wanted to tell my classmates why I couldn't speak very much of my language. The past is our history and everyone should know. Our class learns some history like Remembrance Days and wars, so we should also talk about residential schools so that it won't happen again." I think that's a really amazing thing for a 7-year-old to say and to recognize. And one of the things that I think is so important about the literature is that unlike other literature of this sort, other survival testimony, one of the things is that these books show us very clearly how even though this system tried to take away language, tried to take away culture and tradition, tried to disrupt the link between families and the children, nonetheless, these people survived. And we need to recognize that. Because one of the things that I think is so important is that as Canadians, we have to confront our racism. You know, in December, when Chief Spence was on her hunger strike, I would open up the paper and I would read these great articles by First Nation activists about Idle Lamorne, about Chief Spence, and I was so excited because it seemed like change was in the air, that something was happening. And then I would look at the comments, and I felt sick. I mean, I'm white. I'm a settler. I felt sickened by what people were saying, by their ignorance, by their inability to understand that if First Nations peoples are in the kind of state that they're in, it's not their issue, it's our issue. We put them there. We created the residential school. We wrecked their communities. We took away that connection. We took away those connections, as Basil Johnson was saying, to the land. We took away people's language. We took away their culture and traditions. How can we not take responsibility for it? And I often think about, this notion of the survivor, right? Because when I was in high school, even though there had been earlier texts written about the Holocaust, books like Anne Frank, for example, that comes out actually not very long after the end of the Second World War. It comes out in I think 1948. So there were certainly books about the Holocaust, but the big outpouring of Holocaust literature doesn't take place until the 70s. So, there we are. The war ends in 45, and then we have this outpouring, nearly 30 years later. Well, is it any surprise that we didn't have a literature of the residential schools in the same way? Because it takes a long time to heal. But I think what these books do, and what I think is so powerful about them, is they provide a means where we can talk about the experiences in a way that is both respectful of the experiences themselves, because these are experiences told by survivors or from within First Nations communities. But also, the other thing is that they provide us with a way of thinking about the residential school experience in a way that most connects with our hearts. Because we can see in these books, these very short books, Sapitza is just over 100 odd pages. Fatty Legs and The Stranger at Home aren't much longer. And they tell us exactly how young people felt. That sense of developing a new way of surviving, of coping. At the end of The Stranger at Home, one of the things that is really remarkable is that Margaret Pokiak's father, who himself was a residential school survivor, asks his daughter to do something that he feels will really challenge her as an individual. Although Margaret has been home from the residential school for over a year, she has two younger sisters who are now of age to go to school. What's changed in their world is that, and one of the things that's amazing about this story is this takes place in the Arctic, in Canada at a time when, of course, the rest of Canada is beginning to dismantle the residential school system. And in the north, they're building up the residential school system. And at this particular moment, it has become the law that children have to go to residential school, and that, as with earlier threats, parents could be put in jail. They could have their supplies taken away, you know, the things they would get from the Indian agent, they could have those stopped if they didn't follow the law. And so Margaret's two younger sisters are going to be going to the residential school, and her dad asks her to go back to school as well, so that there's someone there to protect them. Because one of the things that Margaret has learned is that even though she loves to read, she's one of those lucky kids who actually got enough education at the residential school to find the value of books and reading. But her father also realizes that he cannot let his other daughters go there alone. There has to be someone there to act as their protector. In the same way that earlier we heard about Basil protecting a younger child and acting as their little, as their older brother. And it's an amazing story. These are picture books, these are novels for young adults that are out there, and there are more coming. Dave Robertson, whose graphic novel Sugar Falls is an amazing testimony to the residential school experience, is working on a series of graphic novels that are going to look at those texts. And I know there are more to come, more stories to hear. We need to be able to recognize what young people can do if we give them a chance. Because one of the things that we should think about is that if we tell young people the stories, they do act. Unlike adults, they don't sit on their butts, they actually get off them. We've got Wes Prankard, who started his charity Northern Starfish as a response to seeing stories in the news about Attawapiskat, and has raised enough money to build playgrounds in that community. There are people like Takaya Blaney. Now she's 12, but she has been since 10 years old, an outspoken opponent to the Keystone pipeline. We've got wonderful people, Andrea Landry, who just came back from New York, where she sits as a member of the Youth Council for the UN Indigenous, God, now I'm going to forget what the council is actually called, but she's a student, a graduate student, a master's student at University of Windsor. There are young people who are doing all kinds of things. There's a charity called Books with No Boundaries. Two white girls from just outside Toronto decided that it was essential that young people in the North receive books, and not just any books. You know, James Bartleman several years ago put out a call to raise money and to send books to the North, but they took any books, right? They took new books, they took used books. No, these girls decided that no, children in the North needed to have books of their own, good books and new books, and so they've raised money to send, at this point, $16,000 worth of books to the North. Young people do things when we give them the information, when we provide them with the tools to make change, when we teach them to think critically. The way that we're going to have to confront our own legacy of shame with the residential schools is to provide them with access to these books for them that will give them a sense of what we did in this country to First Nations people, what we did to them at the time, and how that legacy continues to this day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Just wait a moment. We have a gift of appreciation. I want to let everyone know We are doubly appreciative because 7 minutes ago, Jeffrey was supposed to be in class and will be rushing to teach and will then rejoin us later in the afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lunch is now available in the room directly next door where coffee and muffins were this morning. During the lunch break, there will be a slideshow being shown here on the screen that was prepared by members of the Aboriginal Students Organization here at York University. You can come back and eat watching the slideshow. You can eat out in the atrium if you would rather be in a different kind of environment. We will resume back in here at 1:30. Thank you very much.